The old man ate 3 bites of pot roast, set down his fork, and told me, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it over the sound of the wind against the windows, that no one had cooked him a proper Sunday supper in 19 years. I didn't know, that first evening, what 19 years meant to him. I only knew he was the loneliest human being I had ever sat across a table from, in a ranch house so quiet it seemed to hold its breath, and that whatever had happened 19 years ago had never once, in all that time, loosened its grip on him. I found out, eventually, exactly what 19 years meant. It meant a wife buried in the ground behind the barn. It meant a daughter who left in grief and anger on the worst night of both their lives and never fully came home again. It meant a ranch quietly drowning in debt that a proud old man had told absolutely no one about, not even, especially not, the daughter who might have been able to save it. And it meant that the recipe I'd used for that pot roast, one I'd found faded and stained in a battered tin box in his kitchen, thinking it was simply a good, plain recipe, worth trying, was actually the last meal his late wife ever cooked him, made from her own handwriting, in her own kitchen, and I had no idea, ladling gravy over that meat, that I was about to accidentally call a lost daughter home. But before I tell you how that happened, do me one quick favor. If you've ever sat with someone so lonely it scared you, hit that subscribe button right now. This whole channel is built for the people who finally get a seat at somebody's table again. Go on. I'll wait. Now let me back all the way up. Because to understand how a pot of gravy brought a family back together, you first have to understand a fresh start gone quiet, a little girl who missed her mother, and an old man's porch light burning every single night for no one. My name is Caleb Whitfield. I am 34 years old, and 8 months ago I moved my daughter Ellie out to a small rented property in ranch country, about as far from our old life as I could manage on what I had left after the divorce. Ellie's mother and I split up 2 years back, and the split was hard on both of us, but hardest, I think, on Ellie, who was 6 when it happened, and old enough to feel the whole house change shape around her, without fully understanding why. I took the custody arrangement that gave me most of her time, because I could not stand the thought of a house without her laugh in it most days, and when a job opportunity came up out here, teaching shop and basic agriculture mechanics at the regional school, I took it, mostly because I wanted a slower, quieter place to help both of us heal. I'll tell you something I learned fast moving out here. Country quiet and lonely quiet are 2 very different things, and it took me a while to understand which one I was hearing most nights, sitting on our little rented porch after Ellie went to bed, missing a marriage that hadn't worked, but had at least filled a house with noise. Ellie was struggling too, in her own quiet, 6-year-old way. She'd taken to sleeping with the hallway light on, something she'd never needed before the divorce, and some nights I'd hear her get up, just to check that it was still burning. A small ritual I understood better than I ever said out loud to her, because grief, even a child's, has a way of needing a light left on against a dark it can't fully explain. I used to lie awake some nights myself, in that unfamiliar rented house, wondering if I'd made the right call, uprooting her from everything she knew, for the sake of my own need for quiet, wondering if a slower life out here was actually healing either of us, or just giving the loneliness more room to spread out in. That, right there, is most of the story. Everything else is just details. Now let me tell you about Henry Calloway, my neighbor. His ranch sat next to our little rented property, several hundred acres of land that had clearly, once, been something impressive, and was now, just as clearly, being held together by not much more than one old man's stubbornness. I'd see him some mornings, working cattle or mending fence alone, moving slower than the job probably needed, and I'd wave, and he'd give me a short nod back, and that was the whole of our relationship for the first few months. What changed it was his porch light. I noticed, maybe 2 months in, that Henry Calloway's porch light burned every single night, all night, dusk until well past dawn, in a house that, as far as I could ever tell, held exactly one person. I mentioned it once to a woman at the feed store, mostly out of idle curiosity, and she got quiet for a second and told me, in the careful voice people use for old grief in a small town, that Henry had kept that light burning every night for going on 19 years, ever since his wife Margaret died, because Margaret had always been afraid of the dark out on that empty land, and Henry, even with her gone, could not make himself turn it off. Old habit, the woman said, or maybe just love that didn't know where else to go. I could not stop thinking about that porch light. I have a daughter who still, some nights, needs a light on in her hallway, because the dark makes her miss her mother sharper than the daylight does, and something about a grown man keeping a light burning 19 years for a wife who couldn't see it anymore landed in me somewhere deep and would not let go. So one Sunday, on something close to an impulse, I made too much pot roast, the way you do sometimes when you're cooking for two and forget to scale down the recipe. And instead of freezing the extra, I packed it up warm, brought Ellie along, and drove over to Henry Calloway's porch and knocked. He opened the door looking like a man who hadn't had an unexpected knock in a very long time, wary, almost alarmed, and it took him a good few seconds to find words. I told him, plainly, that I'd made too much supper and didn't want it to go to waste, and would he mind some company for an hour. I watched something complicated move across his weathered face, pride wrestling with something that looked almost like hunger, not for the food exactly, but for the offer itself. He let us in. That first Sunday supper was quiet and a little awkward, Henry clearly out of practice at conversation, Ellie shy around the tall, silent old rancher. But by the time we were clearing plates, something had eased in the room, and it was on that first night, over the last bite of pot roast, that Henry Calloway set down his fork, looked at me with an expression I still think about, and said, so quietly I nearly missed it, that no one had cooked him a proper Sunday supper in 19 years. I did not press him that first night, but I started coming back. Every Sunday, without fail, Ellie and I would bring supper to Henry Calloway's quiet house, and slowly, the way trust builds with an old, guarded man, he started talking. About Margaret, mostly. At first, the way grief will often come out sideways before it comes out straight. And then, gradually, about the rest of it. He told me about Margaret's death 19 years back, an accident on the ranch itself, a piece of old equipment that failed on a day Henry had put off having it serviced because money was tight that season, a fact that had eaten at him every single day since, whether or not it was truly to blame. He told me about his daughter, Rachel, 17 at the time, who had been in the middle of a screaming, furious fight with her father the very night before her mother died. A fight about Rachel wanting to leave for college in the city, a life beyond the ranch, and Henry, frightened and controlling in his grief, before the grief had even fully arrived, refusing to let her go, insisting the ranch needed her, insisting her place was here. Margaret died the next morning, and in the chaos and horror of that day, something broke between Henry and Rachel that never properly healed. Rachel, 17 and grieving and furious, blamed her father, loudly and without mercy, for both the accident and, in her rawest moments, for somehow trapping her mother on that ranch until it killed her. Henry, wrecked with his own guilt and unable to find the words to comfort a daughter who wouldn't let him near her, retreated into a silence that, over the following months, hardened into something neither of them ever managed to break through. Rachel left for the city the week she turned 18, exactly as she'd always planned, except now leaving in anger instead of hope. She built a life there, entirely her own. No help from the ranch, no contact with her father, beyond the occasional stiff card at Christmas that neither of them, Henry admitted, ever really knew how to fill with anything true. 19 years had passed. Henry had no idea, he told me, plainly, whether his daughter was even still alive some days, only that she was, because the cards, thin and formal as they were, still came. I let my pride do the talking for 19 years, he told me one Sunday, staring at his hands. I was too proud to admit I'd been wrong to hold her here, too proud to say I was sorry, too proud even to let this town know how bad the ranch had gotten without her, because admitting that felt like admitting I'd failed twice, once as a husband who couldn't keep his own equipment safe, and once as a father who drove his own daughter clean out of his life. That last part, about how bad the ranch had gotten, was the piece I didn't fully understand until a few weeks later, when I found him out by the barn one evening, staring at a stack of unopened mail with an expression I recognized instantly, because I'd worn it myself during the worst of my divorce. It was the exact look of a man drowning quietly and telling absolutely no one. I asked him straight out what was in that mail, and after a long silence he told me. The ranch, it turned out, was carrying debt that had built up slowly over years of declining cattle prices, rising costs, and an old man doing the work of what used to take 3 hired hands, alone, because he could no longer afford to pay anyone and was too proud to ask his daughter or anyone else for help. A development company had made an offer to buy the land outright, generous on paper, and had set a deadline, 30 days out, after which, Henry's own lawyer had warned him, the bank's patience with his mounting arrears would likely run out regardless, forcing a far less generous sale under much worse terms. Henry Calloway was, quietly, 30 days from losing the only home he'd ever known, the land his wife was buried behind, and he had told exactly no one, least of all the daughter who might, with her own resources, have been able to do something about it, because he could not bear for her to know he'd failed that badly too. I sat with him a long while that evening, and I want to tell you honestly, I did not know, at that point, that Rachel Calloway had become anyone in particular. I only knew Henry needed his daughter, and his daughter, wherever and whoever she'd become, needed to know her father was about to lose everything and was too proud and too ashamed to ask her for help. So that night, without telling Henry, I asked him for one thing: the last address he had for her. Continued in the next part. I wrote Rachel Calloway a letter, an actual paper letter, the old-fashioned way, because I did not have an email or a phone number, only an address nearly 2 decades old that Henry kept folded in his wallet from the last card she'd sent. I told her plainly who I was, a neighbor, nobody important, and I told her, as gently and honestly as I knew how, that her father was about to lose the ranch, that he had told no one, that he had kept her mother's porch light burning every single night for 19 years, and that whatever had happened between them, I did not think either of them had 19 more years left to keep not talking about it. I did not ask her for anything. I only asked her to know. I did not hear anything back for 2 weeks, and I began to believe the letter had simply vanished into whatever life Rachel Calloway had built far away from that ranch. And then, on a Sunday evening, while I was in Henry's kitchen finding my footing with yet another meal, I opened his old recipe tin, the one Margaret had kept, looking for inspiration, and found, tucked near the back, a card in careful, looping handwriting, labeled simply Sunday pot roast, stained soft with years of use, clearly the very recipe I had, entirely by accident, already made for Henry on that first night, having pieced it together, mostly from memory and instinct, rather than from the card itself, which I hadn't yet found. I sat there a long moment, holding Margaret Calloway's own handwriting, understanding, with a chill, that the pot roast that had cracked something open in Henry that first night had been, without my knowing it, an almost exact echo of the very last Sunday supper his wife had ever cooked him. I made it again that Sunday, properly this time, straight from her card, and I asked Henry, gently, if he'd mind me trying. He went very still when the smell hit the kitchen, and by the time I set the plate in front of him, he was crying, openly. An old rancher who I don't believe had let himself cry in front of another living soul in 19 years, because the smell alone had taken him straight back to a kitchen and a wife he'd been trying, quietly, to hold on to every single night with nothing but a porch light. It was in the middle of that particular Sunday, Henry still wiping his eyes at the table, that a car I didn't recognize came slow and uncertain up the long drive. Rachel Calloway got out of that car, looking like a woman who had rehearsed this moment 100 times on the drive out, and still wasn't ready for it. I recognized her instantly from a school photo Henry kept, aged 19 years, but unmistakably the same sharp, careful eyes. She was, I would learn over the following hour, a genuinely successful businesswoman, having built, from nothing, over nearly 2 decades away from that ranch, a respected agricultural investment firm, one that, with a bitter irony neither of us missed once she explained it, specialized in helping struggling family farms and ranches restructure their debt and stay in the family rather than sell out to developers. Work she had thrown herself into, she admitted quietly, partly because some unexamined part of her had never stopped trying to save the one ranch she'd never let herself go back to. She stood in the doorway of her father's kitchen, and Henry stood up from the table, slow and uncertain, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. And then Rachel's eyes went past her father, to the plate on the table, to the particular color and shape of that pot roast and gravy, and I watched recognition hit her like a physical blow. "That's Mom's recipe," she said. Her voice broke clean in half. "That's exactly her recipe. I would know that smell anywhere. A neighbor's been making it," Henry said, and his own voice was barely holding. "Found the card in your mother's tin. Didn't even know it. First time he made it. Just made it the way he thought was good. And it turned out to be almost exactly hers." Rachel looked at me for the first time, and I saw the question in her face. Why a stranger's kindness had reached her when her own father's silence for 19 years had not. And I did not have a tidy answer for her, only the truth, that sometimes the people closest to a wound are the ones least able to reach across it, and it takes someone standing a little outside the hurt to finally bridge it. I want to tell you, honestly, that the reconciliation that followed was not instant or easy. Rachel and Henry spent that whole evening, long after Ellie and I had quietly excused ourselves to give them privacy, talking, and by every account Henry gave me afterward, some of it was raw and painful, 19 years of unsaid things finally coming out in one long, hard night. Rachel told him, he said, exactly how it had felt to be 17, and furious, and grieving all at once, to watch her father go silent instead of reaching for her, to spend 19 years half believing he blamed her, somehow, for surviving the fight they'd had the night before her mother died. And Henry, for the first time in 19 years, found the words he'd never had back then, told her plainly that he had never once blamed her for anything, that his silence had never been anger, only shame so heavy he hadn't known how to open his mouth without it all coming out sideways. But they talked. That was the whole of the victory, that first night. They finally talked. Over the following weeks, once Rachel understood the true state of the ranch's debt, she moved with the same fierce competence she'd clearly built her whole career on, restructuring the loans through her own firm's expertise, personally guaranteeing what needed guaranteeing, and quietly ensuring that the development company's 30-day deadline expired with an empty offer and a ranch that was, for the first time in years, no longer drowning. She did not do it as a rescue, she told her father plainly, but as an investment in land she had never actually stopped loving, whatever she'd told herself for 19 years. And in a father, she had never actually stopped needing to forgive, and to be forgiven by, in equal measure. Now, Here is the part of this story I most want you to hear, because it's the part that matters most to me. Rachel Calloway, once the ranch was secure and her relationship with her father had begun its slow, real mending, came to me with an offer, a genuinely generous one, a finder's fee, she called it, for the letter that had started the whole reconciliation, enough money to matter considerably to a single dad on a teacher's salary. I turned it down. I didn't write that letter for money, I told her, and I'm not going to let it turn into a transaction now, after the fact. I wrote it because your father kept a light burning for 19 years for a wife who couldn't see it, and because I have a daughter who still needs a hallway light some nights, and something about that broke my heart enough that I couldn't just keep quietly eating Sunday supper next door and pretending I didn't see it. If you pay me for that letter, then every time I think about this whole thing, I'm going to remember the check instead of the moment your dad cried into a plate of pot roast. I'd rather keep the moment. Rachel studied me for a long moment, the way her father had studied me that first Sunday, and then she asked, more quietly, "Then what can I actually do? There has to be something." And I told her the truth, which had been sitting in me since that first Sunday I noticed Henry's porch light. "There are more Henry Callaways out here than anyone realizes," I said. "Old ranchers and farmers, scattered across land too far apart for anybody to notice how quiet their houses have gotten. Whole lives built out here alone. Nobody checking in. Nobody bringing a Sunday supper. If you want to do something real, with what you've learned bringing your own dad back from that kind of quiet, build something for the rest of them. A program, real volunteers, matched up with isolated older folks out on these ranches, just for company, just for a shared meal now and then. Not charity, just somebody showing up on a Sunday, the way I did for your dad by accident." Rachel built exactly that, funding it initially through her own firm and eventually growing it into a genuine regional nonprofit, matching volunteers with isolated elderly ranchers and farmers across 3 counties for regular visits and shared meals. A program she named, simply, Sunday Suppers, and one she still personally drives out to participate in herself most weekends, whenever her work allows, sitting at tables with strangers, the way a stranger once sat at her father's. Henry Calloway still keeps that porch light burning every night, but it means something different now, I think. Less a lonely vigil, and more an old habit of love that his daughter, home most weekends now, understands completely, because she keeps it burning right alongside him when she's there. Ellie has more or less adopted him as an honorary grandfather, and he has taught her, patiently, more about this land and these animals in 8 months than I could have taught her in years, a gift I did not expect when I knocked on his door with too much pot roast and an awkward 6-year-old in tow. There's a version of this where I take Rachel's check and let it quietly become the story I tell about that Sunday, a lucky letter that paid off well for a struggling single dad. And there is no version of that where I get to sit at Henry Calloway's table now, most Sundays, and watch a father and daughter finally, slowly, learn each other again over a recipe that started it all. I picked the true thing over the payday. I'd pick it every single time. So let me leave you with this tonight. An old man kept a porch light burning for 19 years, alone, too proud to ask for help, while his own daughter, not so far away as either of them believed, built a whole career around saving land, just like his, without ever once letting herself go back to save the one ranch that actually needed her. It took a stranger's pot roast and an old recipe card neither of them knew was still sitting in a tin to finally call her home. So here is what I honestly want to know from you tonight. Is there a porch light burning somewhere in your own life? An old, unresolved silence with someone you love, that pride has kept both of you from finally walking toward? Or is there someone near you right now, quiet and alone, who hasn't had a proper Sunday supper in longer than anyone around them realizes? You don't need a grand gesture. You just need to knock, with a little too much food, and see what happens. Tell me about it down in the comments. I read every single one, and tonight, yours is the one I most want to hear. And if this story reached you, if you believe, like I've come to believe, that most silences break easiest over a shared table, then do me one small favor before you go. Subscribe, so the next story finds you too. Leave a like, so somebody else finds the nerve to knock on a lonely neighbor's door this weekend. And go make a little too much supper on Sunday. You never know whose whole life it might change. I'll be right here, reading every word.